I just turned it on.
They can understand. Shanice will understand almost everything. Denise will understand some of it.
Hallo, guten Morgen.
Guten Morgen. Und für Caleb. Okay, anybody need a pen or pencil? They won't understand anything in here. So if you can teach them something, they'll understand. Shanicia, you will understand them, won't you? You understand Miss MM? Yes. 5 years ago, I was teaching her in English in Sunday school. She could understand then. I know she can understand now. She always says, ich verstehe gar nicht. And then I say something and she catches herself doing what I said to do. Ich verstehe nicht. Okay, who needs a pen or pencil? You have one? Okay. Nick, you should, there's probably a whole bunch back there floating around. You look like Nick, I'm sorry. Caleb.
Thank you.
That's an insult.
You're in it.
Oh, we'll tell Nick that.
Yes.
I don't see any.
To Caleb. Sorry.
Okay,
And markers.
Carolyn, if you'll help Stefan with this one, help him understand the question.
I don't have pens back here in abundance. I have a pen here.
Let's go through it together. I mean, don't say the answers out loud, but I'll read the questions, and then if you have a question about the question, understanding what they're asking, just ask and then put in your own answers. Secular historians agree upon a clear list of Egyptian kings. Is that true or false? Let's not talk about the answers. Let's let everybody else find their own answers.
Oh. That's awesome.
Okay, so have the secular historians figured out the timeline and the names of the Egyptian kings and the chronology, who came before whom? Number two, the Israelites were enslaved to build the Great Pyramid of Khufu near Cairo. True or false? Don't worry if you don't know the answers to these. This is not to determine whether you pass on to the next grade or whether you have to repeat the class. This is just to find out what do we know before we start. True or false? Abraham would have been acquainted with mathematics and other scientific understanding. Would Abraham have had knowledge of mathematics and science? True or false? Joseph's name is inscribed in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Have they found Joseph's name in the records there? True or false? The Great Pyramid was built around 2600 BC, before Christ. 6, true or false? Moses would have taken the throne of Egypt as a pharaoh had he not fled to Midian. And number 7, many secular historians doubt the account of the Exodus because they are looking for evidence in the wrong time period. That's not meaning that's the only reason they doubt it, but that's one of the reasons that they haven't found evidence of it. The secular historians don't find evidence of the Exodus, of the several million Israelites leaving Egypt, because they're looking for it in the wrong time period. Is that true or false? Okay, we're ready for our first video.
Now, there is one more very interesting aspect of this pyramid. People often ask me, how old are the pyramids? Well, by the usually accepted chronology, these pyramids were built about 2600 BC. But if we accept the biblical chronology, it means that the universal flood occurred about 2300 BC. Now, that means that this pyramid would have to be later than that. In fact, according to Dr. Emanuel Velikovsky's revised chronology, it would place it about the 19th century BC, and that would be about the time that Abraham visited Egypt. You know, you have the record in the book of Genesis of Abraham coming down here to Egypt and talking with the Pharaoh and so forth. Now, remember where Abraham came from. He came from Ur of the Chaldees. And Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations there from 1922 to 1934 revealed that the Sumerian civilization was the world's first civilization. And they had a remarkable understanding of mathematics and astronomy and trigonometry and other sciences. Well, now, Josephus, the Jewish historian, made a very interesting statement. And I want you to listen to what that statement says.
Abraham communicated to them, that is the Egyptians, arithmetic, and delivered to them the science of astronomy. For before Abraham came into Egypt, they were unacquainted with those parts of learning. For that science came from the Chaldeans into Egypt.
So, if that is correct, and Abraham came here during the time of Khufu, that would explain something very interesting. You see, this pyramid is exactly square. It is exactly level. It is exactly orientated north, south, east and west. And if you were to take a circle with the top of the pyramid as the centre of the circle and apply the formula 2 pi r, you would find that that would be the exact circumference of the base of the pyramid. Well, now, either that's a remarkable coincidence, or it means that the Egyptians at this time knew the formula 2 pi r. And where did they get it from? Well, if Abraham imparted to them this knowledge, that would explain it all. And so it raises the interesting possibility that the Egyptians may indeed, as Josephus says, have learned their astronomy and their mathematics from Abraham, who brought it from Ur of the Chaldees.
Okay, stop. One interesting point that I have found in one of the world history books that I'm reading is the comparison of scientific knowledge among the Sumerians, the Chaldees, and among Egyptians. And basically they said, that this book says that these two civilizations arose independently of each other, and the Sumerians developed science and art and religion and mathematics. The Egyptians did not develop it, but somehow there must have been some contact between the Sumerians and the Egyptians, because the Egyptians learned all this, even though they did not develop it themselves. And the author of this book, this book was written in the 1950s, but he says that so far they haven't found the evidence of who it was that carried this information to the Egyptians, but there must have been some contact, obviously, because the Egyptians suddenly learned all this stuff. Where did they get it from? How did they get it from the Sumerians? As Dr. David Downs says, this is all hearsay. We don't know where Josephus got the information, but he was a very, very accurate, very careful historian. He was always very careful to tell what he saw rather than what he wanted people to remember, what he wanted people to think about the Jews. He told good as well as bad about the Jews, about the nation of Israel. Whatever evidence he found, he reported. And so I don't know where he got the information where his claim that Abraham was the one who took mathematics to the Egyptians, but we do know, as he said, that the Chaldeans did have this knowledge. They were very, very advanced in mathematics, in science, astronomy, and the Egyptians were not. Suddenly, around 1900 BC, the Egyptians knew advanced mathematics and astronomy, and the result was the Pyramid of Khufu. One of the questions on the answer sheet, one of the questions on the quiz, number 2, the Israelites were enslaved to build the Great Pyramid of Khufu near Cairo. Now, is that true or false, according to what we've learned so far? Khufu is the pyramid that Dr. Downs was sitting in front of. False. Yeah, that would have been built shortly after Abraham's trip to Egypt. Okay, that was the first pyramid that was four-square. The corners were north, east, south, and west. And as he said, that the radius, if you take the height of the pyramid from the ground to the apex as the radius of a circle, then you take that radius and put it in the formula 2 pi r, which tells you the circumference of a circle. The circumference of the pyramid is the result of that formula. So in other words, they understood the connection between the number pi. They probably didn't call it pi because the Greeks hadn't developed their language yet, but they understood the mathematical relation between the radius of a circle and the circumference. So the circumference of that circle that has the radius as the height of the pyramid is the same circumference of the square pyramid. Okay? Let's number 3. That also is answered in this video. Abraham would have been acquainted with mathematics and other scientific understanding. Is that true or false? True. Yeah. He carried that information with him from Ur of the Chaldees. Okay. I don't know how long he went to school. I don't know whether he enjoyed whether math class was his favorite class, but he would have known all of that. Okay, let's start the next video. Joseph in Egypt. Yes, I'm sorry. Sorry. Yes, number 5. Thank you. That also was answered in this video. The Great Pyramid, was it built around 2600 BC?
False.
Yeah, that's false.
Yeah.
And how do we know that? it's been a long time since we had this lesson, but remember the flood?
Give the dating of the
That was
flood.
about 2,349 to 50 BC. Okay, so any civilization that was built before 2,350 BC is gone. There's no more buildings, no more records, nothing left of it, because it was all destroyed in the flood. Okay, and that's the problem we have with this history book that I'm reading. It talks about civilizations, about records going back to about 4,000 BC, and records of communities that had started gathering together as far back as 9,000 BC. There's a huge problem with that because the flood was approximately 2,350 BC. If we accept the Bible as our ultimate authority, which of course we do if we're Christians, we have to. We have no choice. This is God's Word. If we believe that He will lie to us in here, then we also have to believe that He will lie to us about having our sins forgiven. Okay? This is our authority. Everything that's in here is true. This doesn't tell us in 2350 BC, God opened the heavens and the windows of heaven and dumped rain for 40 days, but it tells us, we've been through this all before, it tells us ages of people and how many years things lasted, and from that we can go back and set the time. That's how we know that the earth is approximately 6,000 years old. And that's how we know that the flood was approximately 2,350 BC. Okay, so the Great Pyramid could not have been built in 2600 BC as secular historians have claimed. Okay, now, next picture.
This well is at the foot of the hill on which Dothan is built. The stones up near the top are of fairly recent origin, but those stones down the bottom are very old. Well, it is possible that into this pit, which was dry at the time, Joseph was lowered with the intention of leaving him there by the brothers. However, after a while, Judah came along and he said, look, why don't we make a quick shekel out of this? And a caravan of camels was coming along, and he said, let's sell him as a slave. Well, these Midianite traders took Joseph down to Egypt, and there they sold him to an officer by the name of Potiphar. Apparently Joseph decided if he was going to be a slave, he might as well be a good one, and he was so reliable that Potiphar promoted him to be the head over his household. Unfortunately for Joseph, there was some false accusation made against him, and he was flung into prison. Well, while he was in prison there, the two servants of Pharaoh, a butler and a baker, were also flung into prison, and one day Joseph came along and he found them looking very disconsolate. And he said, what's your problem? Well, the butler said, we've had some dreams and we don't know what the meaning is. Well, Joseph said, tell me, I'll tell you the meaning, God knows the meaning. So the butler said, well, I dreamed that I had 3 bunches of grapes and I squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup. Well, Joseph said, that's easy. It simply means that after 3 days you're going to be restored as Pharaoh's butler to squeeze the grapes into his cup. Well, when the baker heard that, he thought, that's pretty good. And he said, well, I dreamed that I had 3 baskets of bread on my head. And the birds came and ate up the bread. Joseph said, that means that after 3 days you're going to lose your head. Well, it happened just exactly as Joseph had predicted. And when the butler was restored, Joseph said, hey, just remember me when you get out because I shouldn't be in here. But unfortunately, the butler completely forgot about it. And it wasn't until about 2 years later that Pharaoh had a dream. And he did not know the meaning. Called in the wise men. They couldn't tell him. And it was then that the butler suddenly remembered, oh, yes, I remember that fellow in prison. So he told Pharaoh about it. And so Pharaoh said, well, bring him here. And so Joseph was brought in, and Pharaoh told him the dream. He said, I dreamed that there were 7 fat cows came up out of the river Nile, and they grazed there. And then 7 thin cows, so thin you couldn't believe it, came up and they gobbled up the 7 fat cows. Well, Joseph said, I'll tell you what that means. It means that there's going to be 7 years of plenty, and that will be followed by 7 years of famine. The Nile is going to stop flowing just about, and there'll be a famine. So you better gather together, appoint somebody to gather together all the grain during those 7 years of plenty, so that when the 7 years of famine comes, you'll have enough to eat. And so Pharaoh said, well, that's a good idea, and what better person could we have to do all this than Joseph? And so Joseph was appointed as the vizier of Egypt. Now the question is, who was this Pharaoh? Which one? I personally consider that the chronology of Egypt needs to be shortened, and in that case, this would take place at the beginning of the 12th dynasty of Egypt. And in particular, the Pharaoh concerned would be the Pharaoh called Sesostris I. And I think I have some good reasons for thinking that. This is a statue of Sesostris I. Actually, he's quite a nice-looking guy, don't you think? Almost a smile on his face. And there's another group of statues in the Cairo Museum. They're clustered around a shrine. There's 10 statues altogether, and they're all identical. And they show him also as a nice-looking fellow. And there's another statue that shows him as a shepherd with a shepherd's crook in his hand. In other words, he was looking after his people. He had an interest in his people. Now, he was the one who made this obelisk over here, and it has inscriptions on all 4 sides. They're all identical, and this was the first large obelisk that was ever made. Now, it is called the Pillar of On, and the biblical record says that Joseph married the daughter of the priest of On, and that fits right in this place here. And so I would identify Sesostris I as the Pharaoh under whom Joseph was promoted to be vizier. Now there is something else. The biblical record indicates that Joseph was a very prominent figure. I'd like you to listen to what the biblical record says in the book of Genesis. Chapter 41. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regard to the throne will I be greater than you." And he had him ride in the 2nd chariot which he had, and they cried out before him, "Bow the knee." So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Now, did you notice just what respect was paid to Joseph? People bowed down in front of him. Now, that didn't usually happen with a vizier. But it so happens that under Sesostris I, we know from history that there was such a vizier, and his name was Mentuhotep. The very well-known Egyptologist Rrbc described the activities of this vizier. I want you to listen to what it says. In a word, our Mentuhotep, who was also invested with several priestly dignities and was Pharaoh's treasurer, appears as the alter ego of the king. When he arrived, the great personages bowed down before him. So you see, this fits in very well with the biblical account, and we do have such a vizier under Sesostris I. But there's other evidence too to support what I'm saying. Well, here we are in the Fayum, this remarkable oasis that supports so many people, and here I think is something very significant. You see this canal, it's a very large canal, and it comes a long way and flows into this oasis which is below sea level and enters a vast lake, and it brings fertility to this whole area. Now the interesting part is that this is called Joseph's Canal, and nobody knows where it got that name. It seems to go back a long way. And it is my opinion that this canal, which was dug during the 12th dynasty, the early 12th dynasty, was dug during the time of Joseph, who knew that a 7-year famine was coming, and so he had this canal dug to provide fertility to the land of Egypt during this time. Now, there's something else I think is very significant, and that is further downstream is a place called Beni Hassan. And at Beni Hassan, there are some tombs. And one of these tombs has on the wall a beautiful painting, well, it used to be beautiful, it's faded now, of some Semitic immigrants who had come into Egypt. And there it shows the type of clothing they wore, the type of domestic animals they had, the type of weapons. You'll even notice this fellow has a musical instrument anyway. So this shows the Semitic immigrants dynasty. Now, who were they? I don't say that they were Joseph and his family, but I do consider it highly likely that they were the Israelite people who had fanned out over the land, and this man thought it significant enough to put it on the wall of his tomb. Now, there is one more thing I want to tell you about. One of these tombs was made by a man by the name of Ammonid, and he also was during the time of Sesostris I. And he left on the wall of his tomb a record of his good deeds. That's what they mostly did, you know, told the gods what a good fellow they were. And among other things, he referred to what he did to prepare for a coming famine. Now, Jan will read you a statement from a historian and a translation of this wall inscription.
No one was unhappy in my days, not even in the years of famine. For I had tilled all the fields of the nome of Mar up to its southern and northern frontiers. Thus I prolonged the life of its inhabitants and preserved the food which it produced.
And so I consider all of this points to the fact that Sesostris I was the pharaoh under whom Joseph was the vizier of Egypt.
All right, some of that we've already talked in our lesson on Joseph, but what do you do about that evidence if you're a secular historian who does not believe in God, who does not believe the Bible? What do you do with evidence like that? Okay, here's a question. The evidence that he's talking about with the Great Pyramid at Khufu, the Pyramid of Khufu at Cairo, and the time frame of when it was built and when Abraham would have been in Egypt, the evidence of Joseph's canal, of a vizier. What is vizier in German? It would be like prime minister nowadays. But I first came across that word in all the fairy tales that I used to read as a kid. There was always a vizier. But it would be like a prime minister, or it would be not an elected prime minister, but he would be the king's right-hand man who advised him, his counselor. But as he pointed out, unique in all the history of Egypt, there was one vizier who the people bowed down to just as they would to the Pharaoh. And we know that the same thing happened with Joseph. We have the evidence of a regional governor preparing for a coming famine. How many of you have ever heard of weather reports, the Weather Channel telling you that next year a famine will come to this part of the world? That doesn't happen, okay? We don't know how to predict the weather. We don't know how to say with accuracy that it's going to rain this afternoon. They give percentages of chance that it will rain, but in 100 years, in all the developments in meteorological science in the last 100 years, they've managed to increase the accuracy of 5-day and shorter weather forecasts to some extent, but the accuracy of weather forecast beyond 5 days has not increased 1% in 100 years. They don't know how to predict a famine. They don't know how to predict the weather for next week. Okay? But this governor prepared for the coming famine. If you're a secular historian who does not believe the Bible, what do you do with evidence like that?
That's it.
You have to discount it. You have to ignore it, push it off to the side, and say, well, that's just a bizarre fluke. It doesn't really mean anything, or probably it didn't even happen. Somebody was lying. But if you start with the assumption that the Bible is true, and you come across evidence like that, it all makes sense. You find in the Bible. The evidence does not prove the Bible. The Bible proves the evidence. But the evidence helps us to understand the Bible. Let's talk just a little bit about why there is such a disparity in biblical chronology of Egypt and secular chronology of Egypt. In fact, there is a huge disparity among historians in the secular chronology of Egypt. There are differences of 1,000 years in what one historian believes and another historian believes, and as far as when this pharaoh ruled. One of the reasons for that is, and this, the secular historians will frankly admit this, there's a chronology war among the civilizations. Okay? As the different civilizations began to realize the importance of documenting history, they had an ulterior motive. Our civilization is the best. We are the best people because we've been around a lot longer. And to prove that, they would greatly exaggerate the time period that their history has been going. They would expand the chronology of their history. This is a known fact. Different civilizations would do that. The Egyptians did that. The Sumerians did that. The civilizations along the Indus River did that. They wanted to show that their people had established civilization before any of the other civilizations. So they all expanded their history. Okay. Also, the fact that at some periods during the Egyptian history where conventionally the secular historians have put after another, there were in fact two pharaohs ruling at the same time in different parts of what is now known as Egypt, what was then known as Egypt. Each pharaoh would claim all of Egypt, but he only actually had control of part of Egypt. It is like the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Emperor was in Germany, in part of what is now Germany, and he claimed that he is the Holy Roman Emperor, but he actually had nothing to do with Rome. He had nothing to do with Italy, but he was the Holy Roman Emperor. There were pharaohs who claimed all of Egypt, but were not able to enforce it because at the same time that they were claiming all of Egypt, there were also other pharaohs who were claiming all of Egypt. Okay. There are lots of little things like that that when you put them all together and you start realizing how much history has been stretched, you can start to compress it and then it starts to make sense. We have time for one more video, and we're not even going to, this is a unique Sunday school class because today we're not even going to have time to get into the Word. But when I come back, we will get into the Word, and we're not even going to have time to finish all the videos. So we'll get into the Word and see what the Bible has to say about some of these things. And we'll compare what the Bible says and secular evidence and see how it all fits together so that we can know that we don't have to discount the Bible in order to believe history. We just have to understand history correctly. Okay, one more.
Now we come to the fifth king of the 12th dynasty, whose name was III. Consider him to be the Pharaoh referred to in the book of Exodus chapter 1 and in verse 8, where it says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them." Well, I consider that by now Joseph would be dead, and this would be the Pharaoh referred to in this verse. And believe me, he's a nasty-looking character, just the sort of fellow you would expect to do this sort of thing. For instance, there is this statue of him in the Cairo Museum. Did you notice the downturned, sour mouth that he's got and the nasty expression? And then here's another statue of him, a similar appearance. And then here is this sphinx of him. I just wouldn't like to know this fellow. And I think he's the Pharaoh referred to here. Sesostris III was followed by Amenemhet III. And he also was a nasty-looking character, as his statues indicate. Here's one, for instance, in the Luxor Museum. And he reigned for 43 years. This is his pyramid that he built here. Not a very big pyramid today, but originally it was covered with stone and a lot bigger than this. Today, all that is left is the core of the pyramid, which is made of mud bricks that are laced with straw. In fact, you can see the little flecks of straw that were in there. And after all, that's what we would expect, isn't it? Because here in Exodus chapter 5 and in verse 7 it says, "You shall no longer give the people straw to make brick as heretofore. Let them go and gather straw for themselves." So I think that this was the Pharaoh who was responsible for this. Another interesting point is that Amenemhet III had a daughter, no sons, and that daughter had no children. Her name was Sebek-Nefru-Re, and this would explain why she went down to the river Nile and saw the little baby Moses in a basket there. You might wonder, well now, why would an Egyptian princess take a little baby from the slaves and propose to make him the next pharaoh? Well, you see, she wasn't down there having a bath or taking a swim. She was down there for ceremonial purposes, worshipping the god Hapi, the river god, the Nile god, and he was the fertility god. And of course, she'd need a god like that if she was infertile. And so she was down there worshipping the god Hapi, the fertility god. All right, and so she sees this little baby comes along and regards it as a gift of the fertility god Hapi. And I think probably she called him Hapi Moses. You see, Moses means drawn out of or born of. In other words, born of the river god Hapi. There are a number of pharaohs called that. For instance, there was Tutmosis, born of the god Tut. There was Ra-Moses, or Ramesses, born of the god Ra. So here we have Moses, born of the god Hapi. Well, he was the baby who was to become the next pharaoh, but he disappears off the scene. And it's not hard to understand why. There was a king by the name of Amenemhet IV, who was intended to be the heir of Amenemhet III. But suddenly he disappears from the scene. I think that was Moses myself, because he was forced to flee at the end of this man's reign. And so we come to the end of this dynasty, and I think it fits in very well with what we know of the biblical history.
Do you see how examining history from a biblical viewpoint helps the history to make sense? And examining the Bible with history in mind helps the Bible to make sense. Here we have a new way of making brick for the pyramid using straw. And that's mentioned in the Bible at the time that the Israelites were enslaved. This king, this pharaoh, Sesostris III, don't know who invented this way of making bricks, but he used this way of making bricks. The earlier pyramids were not built this way, okay? We have his daughter who was childless. She's down the river. As he said, she would have been worshiping the goddess, the god Harpy, the god of fertility, praying to this god to give her a baby, and suddenly she gets a baby. Okay. We have this person who was being groomed, prepared, Amenhotep the Fourth, who was being prepared to be the pharaoh after Amenhotep the Third, and he disappears. It all fits in with the Bible when you accept that the Bible is true. If you don't accept the Bible, that the Bible is true, if you reject the authority of the Scripture, then the history doesn't make sense. And you can't understand the Bible if you reject the truth of the Bible. The natural man receiveth not the things of God, because neither can he know them, because they are foolishness unto him. Okay? And I misquoted that. They're spiritually discerned. The end of Sunday school is at hand, and we haven't finished the introduction yet on this lesson. I'm sorry about that. But read through the account, the mentions of Egypt in the Bible up to the time of the Exodus, and then we'll get back with this when I come back. We're going to leave right after Sunday school. Go get our car and then hook up the camper and drive away. So pray with us that we will not have car trouble, God willing. I'm tired from car trouble, and I'm praying that God doesn't have more car trouble in store for us. I can't imagine why there would be car trouble on this trip, but I'm asking God, please let us have a good trip. We need it. Okay, let's pray and be dismissed. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for your word. Thank you that when we accept the authority of your word, then you can start revealing to us the truth in it and helping us to understand it. If we reject it, then we're on our own, and we can't understand it, and we can't understand the world.